I'm Alan Soldofsky, the Director of Creative Writing at San Jose State. I coordinate the MFA program. I'm one of the poets on the faculty. And here to your right and my left is Professor Katherine Cushing, who is an environmental studies professor and director of global studies at San Jose State, and she's also a water engineer. We're here to talk about water and fire. We call this the poetics of a warming planet. The word poetics is usually applied to the study of literature, looking at it from a point of view of both its technique and its aesthetics. And I think we want to expand that term because we know that water and fire are both essential elements in human life and in human history. And yet, these two elements are responsible for some catastrophic events. The most recent fire I think everybody's heard about is at Notre Dame, right? So we're actually going to be in dialogue with scientists and engineers as poets to think about how poetry and scientific research on the environment interconnects. And one thing that I like to say about this topic, when we think about water and fire and we think about the environmentalist activists among contemporary poets, which go all the way back in California to the early 20th century poet Robinson Jeffers, who lived in Carmel, is that in a way we become the conscience of the earth. And in a way, we try to embody the Earth's consciousness, if we can, thinking in terms of maybe indigenous peoples. How do you embody the Earth's consciousness? And we know that if we keep on going in the direction we're going now, we've weaponized the climate, and that's only going to do more harm. And this is nothing that we can say we can put it off for 10 or 15 years and figure out our economy. This is something that's happening quickly. And within our lifetimes, we will be living in a very different Silicon Valley. This used to be called the Valley of the Heart's Delight. And I hate to think what it might be called after we go through the cycles of drought and flood that might be in store for us. I think that's fair to say when talking to a group of meteorologists. So let me tell you who's here. We have keynote poets. First is Forrest Gander. His latest book, which is for sale in the lobby, is called Be With, and we're proud to announce that with great excitement, he's just been named the recipient of the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for his book. So we're very, very pleased. And this is Arthur's Z, who's sitting next to Craig Clements. And Arthur is a poet and translator. His latest book that was just published a month ago is called Sightlines. He's also the author of another book called Compass Rose, which itself was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize, if I'm remembering right, in 2017. So we have two very, very distinguished poets. And to join them, we have two people in the meteorology department who are driving research and education in climate science. First, we have Dr. Craig Clements, who is director of the San Jose State Fire Weather Research Lab that he was kind enough to let us tour. Craig, recipient of National Science Foundation grants and doing really important work to understand how fire creates weather around it. And then we have Dr. Eugene Cordero, also from meteorology. He is the producer of the Green Ninja series of environmental videos used for education in middle schools, and he is an atmospheric scientist. So he's been studying storms and changes in the atmosphere and things that are driving climate change. And now he's decided he has to do something about it. So he's reaching out to middle school kids and trying to give them an environmental hero to follow and to teach them to be careful with their approach to living in the environment, to live properly. And then here we are as moderators. This is Professor Cushing, who is also a water engineer and an educator. She also directs Com University, who is, want to thank you for helping to sponsor the Poets, along with our other sponsors, associated students, and our event production staff from the, we don't mean to flash that at you, from the Poets and Writers Coalition. All the sponsors are addressed with their logos in today's program, so do pick one up. We have extra flyers if you want to get those. And on the back of the program are little excerpts from poems by Forrest and by Arthur. You can get them signed.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
I'm Alan Soldofsky. I'm the author of In the Buddha Factory, and I'm a person who writes about poetics. So I'm really glad to be here. I've been here for a long time, and I've been waiting since 1985 to get to do things like this. So let's get started. So I'm gonna get my handy iPad working. And so I'm gonna ask this first question, and these are kind of broad questions, and as we reach the finale of this event, we have a mic that we can pass around to the audience. We invite you to participate. We're recording this so that this can be used as an instructional video and stream on the web. We'll probably do that through at least one or two campus websites once we get the final product edited. So my first question is, thinking broadly, what do you see as the interconnection between poetic thinking and ways of knowing and scientific thinking and ways of knowing? This is for everyone.
Can you repeat the question? Just kidding.
I feel like I'm on Jeopardy. Okay, good.
Well, coming from a non-creative background in terms of just being a straight scientist, let's say that's the corridor I stand in. I use science to describe phenomena using the scientific method generally, but I'm actually an observationalist, and I think a lot of scientists are observationalists, and so we collect data using scientific tools to understand nature. But interpreting that nature to the public and to general audiences is very difficult. So my understanding and what I enjoying this meeting today about is really how we can use poetry to describe phenomena for a more general, wider audience. So I think I'm kind of off topic with the question, but that's how I interpret the interaction between poetry and basically science in terms of how we look at phenomena and describe it.
We have a picture of the Negley Park flood from 2017 up behind you, and at some point we're going to prompt Forrest to read a poem called Agua that he translated by a Mexican poet. But we all remember that, right?
I did.
And I'm assuming that you guys studied what happened in the meteorology department when that flood occurred. So maybe Craig, you could, or Eugene, what did you take students out to the flood?
Actually, I have some freshman students, meteorology students, who we're doing a research project together. We're trying to answer the question about whether this flood was due to unusual severe weather or whether it was due to water mismanagement. And as we start to see our climate continuing to change, we have to figure out ways to become more resilient to these kind of extremes. So it is something that obviously water districts and lots of folks have studied, and is a point for inspiration to figure out better ways to manage and also better ways to communicate. This image tells an interesting story on its own.
Did you come to a conclusion about whether it was related to mismanagement or
if it didn't rain, you wouldn't have had a flood. So, but how we manage water is certainly an evolving kind of approach. And so there was a human impact there that could have probably been better resolved. And so if we have another storm of similar magnitude, which we actually have had, we hope that we don't see that same kind of impact.
I guess I'll come back to your question, Alan, about sort of poetry and science, and make a preliminary remark, which is, I think Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And in looking at data for climate change, I think it's important to not just look at the data, but to think about sort of the overall web-like connections that are being made, because like it or not, everything at this point is interconnected. And I think poetry helps us slow down and notice and see and experience the world very carefully and deeply. And that's also essential to a really good scientist. So for me, I think of science and poetry as coming together. Oftentimes in the public, they're thought of as opposites or antithetical. But I like to think that they're forms of inquiry that really matter, and like it or not, they matter more each day. So we need poetry and science to come together to reinforce each other, to use language in an imaginative, emotional, and forceful way, and to take science and use the ways of looking that science and technology can give us, and to use that in a human way.
Should we do an example? We have one. I'm going to put this up on the slide. This is a poem about water. If you're ready, this is a translation. You can explain, please, Forrest.
So this is a poem by a great Mexican poet named Cordero. And I'll read it to you, but before I do, preliminary remarks too, like Arthur said, I'm really interested in different forms of knowledge. I think that in terms of human history, there's never been a time when we've been so dependent upon one particular kind of knowledge, which is kind of informational, logical knowledge. That's one way of knowing, but it's never been the only way that humans take in knowledge. And so science has to be repeatable, and it has to be logical. But poetry gives us a knowledge of intuition and emotions. And those are equally real. Those are as much a part of the fabric of reality as the other form of knowledge. Science is usually written across an equal sign. Sorry? So that, X on one side equals, Y plus 2 on the other side. And poetry can't be written across an equal sign. It's exactly what it is. You can't turn the words of a poem into other words and not have something completely different. So that's a difference between them as well. I was trained, as Arthur was also, in the sciences. I was trained as a geologist, and what Craig talked about, sort of the descriptive concerns of science apply to poetry as well. And my descriptive skills were certainly sharpened by my training in science, where I'm having to look at both large-scale structures to be able to read, uplifts and folds and inclines, and also, I remember working with graptolites in shale formations that were so delicate and so small that I had to be careful my breath didn't blow them away. So those are ways that I think of science and poetry as being interrelated and kind of collaborative in what it means to know. And I'll read this in a second, but Eugene, you haven't said anything yet, so maybe.
So I'm drawn to communication as one of the goals in science. In fact, we have this saying that if you do science and engineering and you don't tell anybody about it, it's a hobby. Whereas to create meaning or value in the world, you have to communicate it. And in the climate science field, we have largely failed at communicating it. If you really just take a look, that we had the science to tell the world that, you know, there are some impacts happening and it's going to get a lot worse. And we thought that if we communicated that via our normal means in scientific publications and in conferences, that the world would react in a responsible way. And yet that's not happening. And in fact, our communication got hijacked by other forces that have been very successfully able to diminish any adequate response. So from that standpoint, I feel like that it's really the artists and people in social sciences and behavioral sciences who are going to inherit this issue if we're going to be successful. Not that we're going to divorce ourselves from the scientists, but that we have to work together. And that's why I think that this type of interaction and these type of approaches are ultimately the direction we need to move in if we're going to have success, because it's not a completely science issue, it's a social, political issue.
So that sets the poem up.
Okay, yeah. And all of us want to thank Alan Soldofsky for imagining this collaborative experience here.
Thank you.
Grateful. Okay, so ¿hay algunas personas aquí que hablan español? Okay, I'll read a few lines of it in Spanish. Poem by Coral Bracho.
Yeah.
Agua de bordes lúbricos, agua de medusas, agua láctea, sinuosa, agua de bordes lúbricos, espesura vidriante, deliquescencia entre contornos deleitosos, agua suntuosa, de involución, de languidez, en densidades plácidas, agua. Waters, lubricious edges, water of jellyfish, lacteal, sinuous water of lubricious borders, glassy thickness, deliquescence in delectable contours. You hear all those S's, all the watery, slidey sounds. Water, sumptuous water of involution, of languor, in placid densities. Water, silken and plumeous in opacity, in weight, mercurial water, in suspense, slow water, the algal bloom, in the paps of pleasure, the algae, the bracing vapor of its peak, across the arched silence, across the isthmuses of basalt, the algae, its abrasive rub, its slippage, light water, fish water, the aura, the agate, its luminous border breakings, fire trailing the fleeing elk, around the ceiba tree, around the shoal of fish, flame, pulsing, lynx water, sargo water, the sudden jasper, luminescence of jellyfish, edge open, lipped, aura of lubricious borders. Water, silken with voltaic charge, at rest, water in suspense, slow water, the lascivious luminescence in its oily breaching over faulted basalt, the slither of opal through the sheen, through the interior flame, water of jellyfish, soft, lustrous water, without a trace, dense, mercurial water.
And that's a poet named
Coral Bracho, one of the great contemporary poets of Mexico.
And for those of you in the audience, I'd like you to try, as kind of a homework assignment, to think of a question that you'd like to ask our panelists. We'll have some time at the end, 10 minutes, for your questions. We'd like to be as interactive as possible. So our next question for our panelists is a kind of a large one. what are the biggest planetary environmental challenges we in the audience should be thinking about and acting upon today? So that's part one. And then part two is how can we make the global local here in the Bay Area? So Forrest and Arthur are coming to us from out of town. I don't know if they know in the Bay Area. From 2012 to 2019, we've had historic drought, flood, and fire, all in the Bay Area. Some of us even had to stay inside, remember, this past winter because the air quality was so bad. So now we actually see the effects of climate change actually hitting home. And so we'd love to hear your perspective on things that we should be doing both locally and globally. We call it glocally. How can we be glocal here? Thank you.
I think that we're all aware of I mean, being here, we're aware of some of the global challenges we have related to the environment. And there's lots of different areas that we could look at, obviously climate or issues related to water or air quality, the state of our oceans, and the state of our species. All of them are under some kind of threat. And yet that is a very challenging endeavor to try to internalize. And as humans, we've learned how to adapt to that, and that is to kind of push that aside and move on with our lives. And yet there's another approach too, which is to say, well, I'm going to do something more local and at least work in that space and do something. So Katherine was inviting us to think about what type of local things we could do to respond to those kind of environmental pressures. And I'm reminded of a movie called, I think it was called Happiness, and it was a kind of a look at what makes people happy and what different factors contribute to that. And there's lots of different factors, community, a sense of purpose, but also working on something that you believe in. So I don't think that there's one thing that I would advocate for in terms of doing something locally, but I would invite people to explore a local issue that you can work with other folks with as well. Because confronting these kind of issues by yourself is very challenging. When you work with others, it gives you some sense of hope. And when you do things and you can see the impact of that, then that also provides some type of reward.
I think I'd like to just personalize for a few minutes my experience in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I've lived for 47 years. But about 4 years ago, my wife and I bought a house on Canyon Road, and it had water rights, and we didn't really fully know what that meant. But what it means is that there is a acequia, there's an irrigation ditch that runs from the reservoir that feeds the city of Santa Fe. There are 4 working acequias in Santa Fe, and so I discovered we were part of one of them, and the water rights meant that I had to walk uphill about a quarter of a mile twice a week, Thursday night to Friday morning, Sunday at 5:30 in the morning to Monday morning at 5:30 in the morning. We had certain rights to the water running in the ditch where I could walk up and drop an irrigation gate and the water flow would back up, and then as the water level rises, the water runs down pipes. It's all gravity fed, and we can water an apple orchard, we can have a garden, we can have bamboo around the house, and then when our time is up, we raise the gate and it goes to someone else. Eventually, the excess water goes into the Santa Fe River, which then eventually goes out to the Rio Grande River, which eventually goes south to Albuquerque into Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. But one of the things that comes to my mind is sort of working locally that is also part of a global issue. So the acequia has taught me, for instance, to work communally. There are 13 families on the ditch, and we clean the ditch by hand once a year, and the water rights owners and other people who have been hired, we work all day and we clean out the brush and clean the irrigation gates. And so when that water is running, we are communally sharing it, and there's a mayordomo, a man who's in charge, who makes sure that the water usage is proper. If somebody is taking more water than they are allowed, they can be fined. If the city of Santa Fe is having a drought, which has happened in the last 5 or 6 years, the voting members of the acequia can vote to limit their water usage, to give the city more of that water. So there's a kind of back and forth and a communal effort. And when the 4 ditch association leaders meet together, they're reviewing all the water irrigation usage in Santa Fe, and they're working with the city. That becomes very empowering. And there are stories in the Depression where families who had nothing would pass sheep bones or cow bones from one family to the other, and they would cook broth and use it for their soup. So there's a whole tradition of communal sharing, valuing water, and making sure it's used properly. And so that's an example of something very local, but feels really good because it is bringing so many people together across economic lines, racial lines, age lines, to work for a common goal.
So I'll answer this question in terms of wildfire in California and the western U.S. I think people can, with the increase in fire frequency in the western U.S. and actually around the world, right now Spain is under fire watch. They started April 1st. All fire agencies in Spain are on call now. Usually it's June. So Europe right now is having lots of fires this early in the season. One thing that people can do, and this is a big problem, is they can manage their own property and homes better. So that's called defensible space, making sure that you do not have vegetation near your home. And so managing your property, those people that live in these areas, what we call the WUI, or the wildland urban interface, those properties need to be managed individually. And that allows, if a wildfire were to occur, that you don't set the structure on fire. It reduces the opportunity for a fire to take hold of the structure. And what we've seen in these devastating fires, the Camp Fire and the Tubbs Fire, what happens is the embers got into the communities and started burning down the structures themselves, the homes. And so then it went from house fire to house fire, house fire to house fire. And so in those situations, there's not a lot you can do, actually. But managing even your gutters and your roof and making sure pine needles are off your property or off the structure will really help in reducing ignition. Another thing that I think people can do is where you choose to live. Now, we don't always have that choice. I live in an urban environment. I live in downtown San Jose. A wildfire problem is not my issue because I don't want to say any, well, this is what a lot of people have thought, but generally, urban environments, except for the fringes, which is again the wildland urban interface, urban environments don't really have this problem. It's rural communities generally. And so people can choose to live in safer locations. There may be a time in our lifetime where we don't have a choice. We may have to move somewhere because of sea level rise, and so we'll probably see that. And how do you make these choices? Is it fair for people to live in the mountains where you know there's going to be a fire, there's high fire frequency, versus urban communities where they don't really have that environmental problem? So I think personal choice in terms of wildfire is managing where you live if you have the capability, and choosing where you may live so that way you're not putting human structures into the environment. So you're not building up the natural environment, which is a problem that we've been doing around the world for thousands of years. So.
I sort of set this up behind you guys. You're talking globally. That's Shanghai in a thunderstorm. I know Forrest is headed there this summer. You're not good.
Thunderstorm. That was Arthur giving a reading.
I thought that's a pretty dramatic picture. Let me show you a poem now. This is Arthur's poem, this is just maybe read this section of it, Arthur. This is thinking globally by looking at local incidents.
So I'll just read this one section of the poem that starts two fawns. And in the slide that Alan just showed, the Pearl Tower is there on the new section of Shanghai.
Yeah.
So the
there it
poem
is.
jumps around globally. Two fawns graze on leaves in a yard. As we go up the Pearl Tower, I gaze through smog at freighters along the river. A thunderstorm gathers. It rains and hails on two hikers in the barrancas. The arroyo becomes a torrent, and they crouch for an hour. After a pelting storm, you spark into flame and draw the wax of the world into light. Ostrich and emu eggs in a basket by the door, the aroma of cumin and pepper in the air. In my mouth, a blister forms, then disappears. At a teak table with family and friends, we eat Dungeness crab. But as I break apart shell and claws, I hear a wounded elk shot in the bosque. Canoers ask and receive permission to land. They beach a canoe with a yellow cedar wreath on the bow, then catch a bus to the fairgrounds powwow.
And there's a picture of the Broncos, I hope. Yeah. Thank you, Arthur. That's the title. That's a poem called Water Calligraphy, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the first long poems. It's a sequence of poems that you can find in the new book, Sightlines. Just to say we have it for sale in the lobby. Katherine?
Oh, great, okay.
Maybe you could do another one. I'm actually thinking about the differences between, now that you've illustrated something, the differences between scientific and poetic language. Because I studied geology too, and I know that really great geology papers and geology books, especially from the sort of classic period of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, are really fun to read, especially if you like to take long car trips. And you can do windshield geology. And I got into poetry because I loved the way geologists described rocks. So what's the crossover? Maybe we start, not my fellow geologist here, Forrest. What's the crossover between the language of geological research and study and poetry?
Both are really concerned with detail instead of with abstraction, I think.
Yeah, there's a beautiful picture of a waterfall that's going to introduce one of Forrest's poems, but I'm not ready. Don't want to hear more about this before we do the poem. I want to hear more about the kinds of detail that scientists are needing to collect as data. That's you, Craig. Detail, because Forrest is describing in beautiful language very small features of the natural world, and yet if you're going to help people understand what these rapidly increasing numbers of fires are doing to the local communities and to the state of California, where we find ourselves needing to wear masks or closing the university because the air is so full of particulate matter that we can't breathe. We need to have a way of at least making it better when the fire occurs for us to put it out and to coexist with it. So I know we've been in your lab. You look at that stuff.
And it just occurs to me that both Arthur and I have taken language from papers of Craig's and used them in poems. His papers are full of detail.
Well, as a scientist, and to follow up on what Eugene said about communicating, sometimes we get lost in the weeds. I tend to. If I'm trying to describe the wind around a wildfire, I'm looking at a very small scale, less than a kilometer, not even a half a mile in horizontal scale on planet Earth, and I'm trying to understand why the wind is blowing a certain way near that fire. And so we describe that with very terse language, and that's how we are trained to write, is keep it simple. I tried to put an exclamation point in one of my first papers because I thought we discovered something really neat, and we almost got it through peer review, but we decided to remove it.
Arthur or Eugene, you want to add to that? Okay, Catherine?
So I have a question for you. Sometimes climate change and extreme weather events can be very hard to explain from both a scientific and poetic perspective. So could you talk about the role that poetry and science can play in helping our audience members, people who may not be experts in climate change and who may not be expert poets, to kind of understand the incomprehensible? For example, sometimes we can't attribute a specific event like a flood or a fire to climate change, but we know that these kinds of events, these wildfires and floods, are becoming more frequent and more intense because of climate change. Sometimes certain areas of the world will cool instead of warm, even though we know it's because the average global surface temperature of the Earth is rising. So these present kind of cognitive anomalies, the dissonance that's really, really hard for us to get our heads around. So how can we work together to kind of demystify some of these phenomena?
I'm going to start with a scientific perspective first, because in Santa Fe, it's also been my sort of privilege to talk with world-class physicists who work at the Santa Fe Institute, which was founded because Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel laureate, thought young physicists were too narrow in their training, that they only knew physics. Murray himself is a linguist and is fluent in 10 languages, for instance, and that affects his worldview. So in contemporary physics, you can look at what's called the butterfly effect, which is supposedly, that a butterfly flaps its wings off the coast of the Yucatan, and it causes a tsunami off the coast of Japan. Well, one event doesn't appear directly related to another, but contemporary physics and chaos theory can show that they are eventually connected. And so I think part of it is, I guess I want to honor the mystery, because I think we're continually discovering as scientists and also as poets and artists the sort of what I like to call the infinite web. And here I'm going to draw on East Asian philosophy. Indra's net says that every thing that exists in the world and every event is like a piece of glass in a chandelier, where every piece of glass reflects and absorbs every other. And I love that image of light shining into a chandelier and the light scattering, but instead of separating, each piece of glass is reflecting and absorbing every other. And I feel like that's the kind of a living web that we're living in. And poetry can help us begin to glimpse or experience some of those connections. And they're not always in linear connections. There are connections that may be delayed or may be related in ways we have yet to understand. But I think ultimately poetry can help us make those connections.
Good answer. Eugene?
Good job. I'm just reminded that, and I was talking to Arthur earlier about some of his poetry, and he was suggesting at least some of the poems he writes require some thought, require some time. And at the university, this is one thing that we teach in our science classes and in all our classes, that life isn't just like quite simple all the time, and science isn't as well. And there's a lot of distractions in the world, and there's a lot of folks who are trying to gather your attention for various means. But as scientists or as artists, our goal is to encourage folks to focus on particular aspects of the world. And I think that the training that it takes to be a scientist or to be a poet requires, like we've been saying, a lot of detail and a lot of maybe some quiet time to really reflect. And that's what we need as a society, to make choices that are reflective of the current state that we're at. And I think that I look forward to reading some of their poems with that thinking that it may not jump out immediately, but that it can take time, and that's time well spent.
This is going to set up a poem of yours, Forrest, so but please
I'm
add your
thinking there's a great Spanish mystic poet, San Juan de Yepes, better known as Saint John of the Cross to English speakers. He has a poem that begins, "Entreme donde no supe, y quédame no sabiendo, toda ciencia trascendiendo." So it's complicated translated because of the way he begins. But you could translate it as, I entered into unknowing, and I remained there without knowing, rising above all science. That place of unknowing has been complicated in the 20th century. It used to be that in Western cultures, say the United States, there was almost a singular source of believable knowledge. You know, there would be 3 news channels with 3 white guys talking on them, saying the exact same thing. And that was given for truth. And as the internet develops and as other voices begin to claim their own truths, the notion of a singular truth that speaks for everyone has diminished. But that means also that people, say Trump, can challenge things that should go as truth and say, no, that's just one truth. The real truth is something else. This is a lie. And so people's faith in sources of knowledge have been diminished. And that's why I think that it's more important now than ever for there to be multiple sources of representations of truth, multiple translations, for instance. So the way Eugene is translating science into a kind of knowledge for young students to understand, the way that Craig is translating science for scientists, and the way that poets translate, so that there's a multitude of voices, the sort of mutuality of which begins to penetrate the competing and disingenuous modes of representing truth.
You wrote a poem, and I think this is the representation of a very romantic representation. It's to show the sublime. There's a lot of artists in the 19th and early 20th century were really interested in going to wild places. I'm not quite sure which waterfall that is, but you see the Bierstadt, for instance, and the Hudson Valley painters showing these monumental paintings of beauty and sublimity in places like Yosemite Valley. The idea is that somehow, if you're quiet and if you pay attention, and enter in that state of not knowing, that being in an environment, in a place, is going to uplift you or change you. And poetry is really good at that. And you wrote a poem about a waterfall, in which a waterfall, you end it with a waterfall, that does that. And I wanted to know if you'd read it. This is the poem. I'll go back and show it one more time, see if I can stop it before it scrolls all the way up.
Well, it connects to what Eugene was talking about just a minute ago, about slowing things down. Because the more we're ramped up by the culture that we live in, which is so full of spectacle and so full of the pressures to move forward, to move quickly, to process things quickly, the more easy it is for us to fall into ruts of perception, because we're not being vulnerable, we're not being open to different forms of knowledge. We're just trying to get that degree and to get that job and to get that promotion. And the fullness of our capacity as human beings is limited, is prescribed by that kind of trajectory. So when Eugene is talking about slowing down, he's talking about slowing down so that you can take in more from different angles. This is a poem in a book that has a lot to do with grieving, and about a moment of self-confrontation that has to do with a change of perception. Madonna del Parto. And then smelling it, feeling it before the sound even reaches him. He kneels at cliff's edge and for the first time turns his head toward the now visible falls that gush over a quarter mile of uplifted sheet granite across the valley. And he pauses, lowering his eyes for a moment, unable to withstand the tranquility, vast, unencumbered, terrifying, and primal. That naked river enthroned upon the massive altar, bowed cypresses congregating on both sides of sun-gleaming rock, a rip in the fabric of the ongoing forest, from which rises, as he tries to stand, tottering, half-paralyzed, a shifting rainbow volatilized by ceaseless explosion.
Maybe we could get into the representation that we've seen of these monumental places where there's great, massive sublimity, where there's water, sometimes where there's fire. In the Bierstadt paintings, there's fire. That slide there is from the campfire. So in a weird way, the campfire, because it was so overwhelming, was a kind of weird negative sublime. That's one of the theorists of philosophy calls that the negative sublime, where something just is so large it takes you out of yourself. The journalist David Wallace Wells just recently published a book called Uninhabitable Earth, thinking about the Earth after climate change, and he says that our passivity in the face of what's happening to our environment, and he calls it an environment that's been weaponized, is that it's just so huge that we stand in awe of it, even though our collective human actions are causing it. So I'm wondering, what is poetry's role in communicating ways of dealing with that which is so overwhelmingly powerful that, as Forrest said in his poem, we stand almost paralyzed by it?
Well, in terms of Wildfire, one thing that I may have stated earlier that we need to remind ourselves of as Californians or people that live in a Mediterranean climate, fire is here. You're not going to get rid of it. This will happen. A campfire will happen again and again and again. We cannot throw more fire engines and more aircraft at the problem. We have to be more resilient in our communities, and that's where we have to change. We have to change our building codes, our structures, where we allow people. It's part of nature. You can't. Fire is unique in terms of natural disasters, because if it's an earthquake, there's no earthquake truck that's going to put out the earthquake. You do not have a hurricane truck. But we have fire trucks to put out fires because we think we can control that. But now the fires are so large, and that's where the climate impact comes. These are the big. And I'm quoting some firefighters that I was talking to yesterday. They said that everybody's waiting for that. They usually, their fire of their career, it's usually the big fire. Like the rim fire was the fire of someone's career. every year there's 2 or 3 fires that is the career fire. It's like, wow, you remember that? It burned forever. So as we go into a modified climate, we should expect more fire frequency and potentially more dangerous fires. And so I think we as humans have to be aware that fire has been on the planet, and cultures before European settlement here in North America dealt with it and used it for creating better hunting grounds and corridors for animals and agriculture and just clearing the space to live. And so fire has always been a positive aspect. We now, in our current culture, fear it, and we try to shun away from it, and we shouldn't. We need to actually put fire into the landscape to manage the landscape better, and that's part of the problem is we've limited fire. We've caught the U.S. Forest Service policy in the early 1900s said, suppress all fires. That's where the problem began. We modified our forest ecology. Now we have too much fuel. Climate change has dried that fuel. We have beetle kill because of climate change. So we have high mortality rates in the Sierra. If you've been to Yosemite National Park and you see all the red phase and gray phase pine trees, that's fuel to burn. So we need to get used to it and better prepare and be more resilient in our community development.
Are you seeing any of those progressive changes in zoning or fire management?
I have not. It doesn't mean that it's not happening. I know the insurance industry is really changing things around, like who can get insurance policies on their property in these zones. So we will see it in the next year or two of changes in policy.
Maybe we can turn to a poem about fire, which is actually a section of water calligraphy, because we realize that fire and water are really interconnected. This is Arthur's poem again. We're putting it up. It's the one that begins with lightning.
So this is the section actually before the one I read. It's also in water calligraphy. And let me just say as background, the Arizona fires, of course, sweep into New Mexico, and this one is, well, it'll explain itself. Lightning ignites a fire in the wilderness. In hours, 200 and 2,000 acres are aflame. When a hotshot crew hikes in to clear lines, a windstorm kicks up and veers the blaze back, traps them, and their fire shelters become their body bags. Piñons in the hills have red and yellow needles. In a bamboo park, a woman dribbles liquefied sugar onto a plate, and it cools on a stick in the form of a butterfly. A man in red pants stills, then moves through the crane position. A droplet hangs at the tip of a fern. Water spills into another kettle. You visualize how flames engulfed them at 50 miles per hour. In the West, wildfires scar each summer. Water beads on beer cans at a lunch counter. You do not want to see exploding propane tanks. You try to root in the world, but events sizzle along razor wire, along a snapping end of a power line.
There's the end of the poem. It's odd how water and fire are intertwined. Maybe just a couple more questions, and maybe one or two more poems, and then we want you to participate. For sure, you're going to get to make your 1:30 class if you have to get to it. We started a little late, so I want to take full advantage of the resources that we have sitting at this table. We couldn't ask for better panelists, so thank you very much. You want to ask?
Oh, sure. So I think of all of you as our sustainability heroes. It's really inspirational to hear about your work and to hear this wonderful poetry. So one of our questions is, what inspires you to do the work that you do? And what advice do you have for our audience on living an inspired life that enhances individual wellness, thoughtfulness, and planetary fitness? Because the theme for Earth Week is power to the planet. So how can we give some of this power back to the planet? Humans and, other biotic entities. Just throw that out there. Thanks.
Well, I'll just give you an example of one thing that inspires me, and that's a young woman named Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who at 15 years of age left her high school and went and sat on the steps of Parliament. And every adult that came by, she would say to them, "You're jeopardizing mine and other young people's future by your inaction on climate change." And just a short period of time later, she started a national movement of students who are leaving school all over the world to protest the inaction on climate change. And there's a beautiful photo of Greta just sitting on these steps by herself with her pigtails. And she's not, she would say, exceptional. She's just a normal girl who has taken a stand, and others have joined her, which is really exciting and inspirational. And we're seeing that in Congress as well. We have never seen a new Green Deal that has that vision of the type of change that we need to see. And I find that very inspirational and very exciting to see this happening at the smallest level, from one individual to a small group of people, of lawmakers. And hopefully this is the type of change that we're going to see continue to happen. So for me, that's something that's very exciting.
I think of I think of being a poet as an ethical activity. I think when you take words very seriously, you're thinking about ethics, that what you choose to look at is an ethical choice. What you choose not to see is an ethical choice. That things like, Pablo Neruda has a poem about people being mowed down in Chile. He says, and the children, and the blood of the children ran in the streets like, and he says, like the blood of children, because he's not going to make an analogy there. What he's saying is that any sort of flourish of language can't make that stronger. And that's not just an aesthetic choice, that's an ethical choice. And poets are dealing with language that way all the time. So I'm inspired by wanting to live an ethical life. And that's my inspiration.
I became a meteorologist because I used to stare at the mountains and watch the clouds flow over. We call those here in the Bay Area waterfall clouds, what we call fog that flows over and it does all these swirls. And I wanted to understand that. And I try to illustrate that in my classes, that, simply looking at the environment, this is our observation. We have remote sensors in our eyes, and we can detect the phenomena by just visualizing what we see. And that still inspires me. When I look at a fire, I unfortunately say, wow, cool. That's awesome, and I really want to understand what's going on inside there. And that keeps me going, and I don't know if it'll ever end, but I hope not. And I feel like as a faculty member here at San Jose State, and as a professor in general, I have the best job. I'm lucky. I get paid to study cool, neat things in nature and translate what my knowledge to students so they better understand the environment around them.
I'll just add a short comment and pick up on Forrest's idea of an ethical choice, because I think obviously as poets we're not doing it for money. We're doing it for our passion for language, and it's a choice of value. You know, I was started writing poetry as a freshman in a calculus class at MIT, and ended up leaving MIT and going to Berkeley and creating my own major in poetry. So it was a huge life change, and my parents, as immigrants from Beijing, were outraged and thought I was going crazy or whatever, but and years later reconciled. But I think for me, you know, inspiration is that passion of discovery. I discovered that although I might have been good at math and science, that was a family expectation, but what really mattered to me was discovering what I could do with language, and that led me to poetry, and it changed my life. And my inspiration is always basically to get up and work each day and to pursue that passion, and I think the rest takes care of itself.
Great. I think this poem of Forrest that's about to come up on the screen, this is an older poem of yours, if you could. It's called Patterns of Unsettlement. And what's interesting is that you don't know what you're going to write until you write it, because you don't know what you see until you see it, right? You can't predetermine what's going to happen in the lab, or when you're observing a fire, you're going to see what you see. You have to capture it somehow, represent it, and use the data, right, if you're a scientist. We as poets, we need to figure out a way to put together in words what it is that's happening inside our perception. And I think you did that really well in this poem.
You know, but since this may be the last poem I read, I'd like to honor our collaboration here, and if you wouldn't mind, Alan, and read the poem that I wrote after reading.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing that. And that will be in Read Magazine 153. We've already paid them to do this. So thank you, Forrest, for letting us commission you and Arthur to write poems for us.
So this is my collaboration with Craig. It's a poem that's based on Sangam literature, a southern India formalized style of writing poems in which subjectivity is very connected to landscape. And this is this desert or wasteland part, and it's written for Santa Rosa, and it's the fire that comes to speak in the poem. Santa Rosa is the town next to the town that I live in, Petaluma. Green spring grass on the hills had cured by June, and by July gone woolly and brown. It crackled underfoot, desiccated, while within the clamor of live oaks, an infestation of tiny larvae clung to the underleaves, feeding between veins. Their frass, that fine dandruff of excrement and boring dust, tinkled as it dropped onto dead leaves below the limbs. You could hear it 20 feet away, tinkling. Across the valley on Sugarloaf Ridge, the full moon showed up, like a girl doing cartwheels. No one goes on living the life that isn't there. Below a vast column of smoke, heat, flame, and wind, I rose, swaying and tottering on my erratic vortex, extemporizing my own extreme weather, sucking up acres of scorched topsoil and spinning it outward in a burning sleet of filth and embers that catapulted me forward with my mouth open in every direction at once. So I came for you, turning the present into purgatory, because I need to turn everything to tragedy before I can see it, because it must be leavened with remorse for the feeling to rise.
So that will be one of the poems that we're publishing in Read Magazine. That will be in the year 2020. Yeah, thank you for, yeah, if there is, yeah. Arthur?
Midnight spark. No rotating convective column of flames pulls a cloud of hot smoke 10,000 feet high. Until July 1st, the precipitation was 1.25 inches for the year. A few young cottonwoods along the river have dropped leaves. Wherever you go, you recall yellow tape and police cars at a gas station. Driving past Quechua Pueblo, you visualize drummers shifting direction, and in the realignment, dancers momentarily pause, then step, with the sound of gourds enacting rain. Approaching La Cienega, you know a wind capable of bending steel pipes around trees. And in the dark, passing cars pulled off the highway, you no longer see lights or rain, but spark at the gap between lightning and thunder, a free fall before the cusp of dawn.
Thank you, Arthur. Well, we're running a little late, so I think we're going to open it up for some questions before you go. We thought we'd end on a positive note. So here's some things to remember. Don't let this happen. You heard from Craig how to defend your house. Like maybe get a metal roof, right? Yeah, or a fireproof one. Don't use up all the water. And if you do, bring it home. So thank you very much for helping us think through this. And we'd like to, we'll use one of these mics if our friend Todd can help us. If you have a question, we'll bring the microphone to you. So just, I saw a couple questions in the back earlier, so put up your hand and feel free to add to our dialogue.
So you guys are mentioning that one of the issues about climate change is that there's maybe been a failure of communication on the part of the climate scientists to sort of fully express in a way that people can understand sort of what's going on. How much of that do you think is just sort of simple ignorance, like people not really understanding the issue, and how much of it is, you know, willful ignorance, people just not wanting to accept it's true because if they did, that would have implications they're just not willing to accept?
What a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was being a little generous with the failure of climate scientists to communicate adequately. But I think your second point is more to the issue. I think if Craig and I were studying the moon's rotational rate, and we claimed that it was 5% higher than other people, no one would care, because that doesn't affect people. But in this case, we're claiming that humans are having an impact on our climate, and it's all the implications afterwards that are, oh, how are we going to respond to that? Is government going to be involved? Are we going to take away people's abilities to pollute or charge for that or those things? And that's why folks have gotten involved in that. It's still a communication issue, but you're right that it's much broader than that, and it's because of those down the line implications in the role of government, the role of policy, that has enacted some groups like fossil fuels lobby to say, oh no, we don't, now we're going to dispute that, just like it happened in tobacco. So I think there's a lot to learn from that story about tobacco and what happened with it in our country. And I completely agree with you that it's much more an issue about what this really means for others.
So the Koch brothers are taking away your funding then? this is a real serious matter, isn't it? How we communicate this. But you were here. You were witness to this panel. You all live among other people. So I guess the thing to ask is for us all to talk about it with people who matter to us, so we can take the actions one at a time that will change our neighborhoods and change our communities for the better.
So one of the things I think that that is more effective than preaching is storytelling. As soon as we start acting like we know something you don't know, and we're superior because we have all this education and knowledge, we'll get people's hackles up and they won't listen. But they do listen to story, and so that's helpful. In my years of teaching here, one of the things I came up against with 19-year-olds is that they're in that phase where all knowledge is relative. Because they've gotten through the phase where, you know, mommy knows everything and I have to believe everything, and then they find out there's no tooth fairy. So then after that, it's like, I don't have to believe anything. My truth is as good as your truth, right? That's the teenage mentality. They haven't gotten to the phase where they realize there's a level of knowledge that we're at, and then we add to that as we go. We don't say, oh, just because we don't know everything, we don't know anything. But we have a president who's in the teenage phase, and and it's running wild. So in order to reach past that, I think it's being able to have those conversations with the difficult people in our lives, not those that agree with us. And working with racism, I'm working with white allies now, and it's very similar in that we need to talk to people who don't believe in it and find out why they don't. And then have that channel into them. Because if I go around being the one that knows, I've got a whole room full of screensavers, you know, and anybody listening. So that's my thought.
A downside of American democracy, I think, that Americans don't defer to people who are smarter and more educated than themselves.
Yeah, I love that point
Them
that you're making, Linda.
intellectuals.
I don't know that this is necessarily a question. I just would be curious what your observation would be in response. I feel like a lot of the reason why we haven't addressed this is because it's been a tremendous failure of leadership, not only political leadership, but also business leadership. And part of that is obviously because people are, again, I think this is, you know, my opinion, but I think it's true, is that people are motivated because they want to make money. And this is really a function of people putting their short-term desire to make money and to have a comfortable life and to have resources ahead of long-term problems. And I just would be curious, how do we tell me to vote yes, but how do we get leaders who actually will do the things that every single person in this room knows that we need to do but are not getting done?
Right, that's a policy change. Well, one of our co-moderator, Katherine Cushing, works with COM University and she works with the city of San Jose, and she just recently came back from a trip to Copenhagen, right, to study how that city addresses these things. How do we, maybe you know, talking with leaders, do we teach them all to write poems?
Yeah, so it was really interesting in Copenhagen when we were meeting with city leaders and the kind of executive directors of community-based organizations. They say with pride, Denmark is a welfare state. Right? And in the United States, we thought, oh, you know, welfare, that means you're not working and you're just living off the government, and that's such a negative thing. But in Denmark, they actually say that word with great pride because it means they take care of their citizens. And the citizens, I mean, although they don't love paying, 75% of their salary, their income to taxes, they recognize that we are all interconnected and part of a human community, and that we need to take care of each other. So they have universal health care, they have free K through 12 education, they have free college. University students get about $1,000 a month in stipends. So I can't say that we can take the Denmark model and bring it over here, but I think there's really lots of interesting questions about what can we as a society do to make a high quality of life for everybody. In the Bay Area, there's a lot of talk about head taxes. I don't know if you guys have heard about that, where high-tech companies actually pay into the system a little bit because they are definitely reaping a lot of the monetary awards of the information economy, but maybe not addressing all the externalities that are caused. Just imagine if 20,000 extra people came in and lived in downtown San Jose.
You mean Google?
Not mentioning any names, and we didn't have adequate public transportation or multi-unit housing to support that. What would that look like? What does that mean? And then are they going to give automatically the city of San Jose or the county of Santa Clara an additional whatever? How much do we need? I don't know, $12 billion it says to address our homeless issues in the Bay Area. So there has to be some kind of reciprocity that I think we're not having those kinds of discussions yet, which to address your question, I think we should be having these hard discussions. So I'm not saying we should all become socialists, but maybe we should. I don't know.
Sam Liccardo, Mayor Liccardo and his environmental staff should come to our symposium next year.
Yeah.
Maybe we can make that happen.
So great questions. And I love the earlier comment about just thinking about how to address teenage knowledge, right? And different ways of knowing and acknowledging kind of the precedents and honoring the knowledge that has come before. I think it's so hard for students right now because they have so much information. They type in, through Google Scholar, although we tell them not to use Google Scholar, they all use Google Scholar. And they type in the keyword and 5,000 sources of information come back to them. And how are they to be the ones to know which ones to pick? We need to guide them through that discussion. Okay.
Any closing thoughts before we go? We really want to thank all of our participants. This is